Magnus Carlsen makes the Ruy Lopez look incredibly easy to play. It can be a tough opening because black has a million different responses. A6, jumping the knight forward, D6, F4, knight here, knight there. But if you're a regular player, there's only 3 main responses you need to worry about, and that's A6, D6, and knight F6. So let's look at 3 of Magnus's games. You're going to see how he simplifies the Ruy Lopez, and you can learn a thing or two to take into your own games. The first match we'll look at is this A6 variation. It's Magnus up against the GM Wesley So. Now I said Magnus makes this look easy. In this match, we're going to be learning the general setup, and then why it's so easy will be more apparent in the second match. So, the first thing about the Ruy Lopez is you are pressuring this knight, but generally it's not the best idea to take it. For example, if you take this knight, recapture, and then you think you've won this pawn, there's a few queen moves that get in the way. First there's this queen move, which attacks the knight and the pawn, but more easily to see is this queen move. You're attacking both these pieces, you end up losing your piece as well, and it's not great. So don't be too greedy about trying to get that pawn out of the opening. It's nice to have this pressure, but don't worry too much about that. So the general move is to just drop your bishop back. It's still nice to have this pressure, but if the bishop ever comes to b3 or c2, that's a really nice square for the bishop as well. So Wesley just develops normally, and Magnus decides to defend his pawn like this. Now you can develop your knights, but generally a nice setup in the Ruy Lopez is to start like this. Once you've castled and get your rook to defend the e-pawn, you can then start thinking about pushing these pawns forward like that. So just play it simple, play that d3. Wesley continues developing, Magnus plays c3. Now the reason for this move is you don't really want this knight jumping in. It's really nice to control this square with your pawns, and like I was talking about, you are eventually setting up that d4 break. So Wesley castles, Magnus castles, these are still just super normal moves. Wesley plays d6. You're going to see, again, this in so many of your games. It's very consistent. You can think more about taking this knight now when they've played d6, because, again, you're trying to ruin their structure. And that can be a good idea, but that's not how Magnus likes to play. Magnus likes to keep it simple. And like I was saying as well, they capture towards the center. It's not the best anyway. So Magnus plays h6. Now that this bishop is available to pin our knight, Magnus doesn't want to deal with that. Especially if you're a beginner, it can be really annoying to deal with those pins. So think about that h6 move, especially once both of you are castled. There's no problem doing that at all. Wesley just drops his bishop back. The reason for this is sometimes you can start a nice pawn storm and bully this bishop around. So that's why you see that move. And now we see the maneuver we talked about earlier. Magnus is preparing to defend the pawn with his rook, so that now is the time that Magnus strikes. Especially now that the knight moves away, because the knight was controlling that square. Magnus pushes d4. Now, Magnus isn't necessarily looking to force this trade or anything anytime soon. It's just nice in these openings to have all this center space. With these 2 pawns, you're controlling all these squares. White has a really pleasant position going into the middle game. So black's first order of business is to defend this pawn. We're threatening to take it twice. So that's why you see Wesley continue to rotate his knight over to the side. And now Magnus just continues to develop his pieces. He's not too worried about blocking in this bishop at the moment, because this knight generally likes to do this maneuver. So he's not worried at all. And now Wesley starts to strike on the queen side. He pushes around this bishop, asks Magnus a question. Again, like we were talking about, you can go to b3 or c2. And Magnus decides on c2 here. c2 can be nice because you're just supporting that pawn. That can be a bit flimsy because your rook is the only piece defending it. And now Wesley continues to strike. He's playing aggressive, and he's sick of how much center space Magnus was starting to get. So this move makes a lot of sense, and it kind of forces a bunch of trades. But Magnus just stays calm. There's no reason for him to release the tension. He's just continuing that maneuver like we talked about, also reopening up his bishop, which could be nice. And now Wesley starts to initiate some trades. So first he takes the d-pawn, trades there, decides not to take. Generally, a bishop for a knight isn't the best in the world unless you have a solid reason for it. And now you can see why over-defending this pawn was a good idea, because this bishop develops to this really strong diagonal, and now it's still well supported. So now Magnus, what this does is this bishop has now moved away from this diagonal, and if that happens in your own games, this knight jumping to the f5 square is so powerful. It's called knife f5 because it's just always so difficult for black to deal with, cuts into their position like a knife, and now we're threatening to capture this pawn. Wesley's response is to push this pawn, which makes a lot of sense. It was going to be pretty difficult to defend where it was. And if both these pawns disappear, both these bishops are going to become very strong, staring right at white's king. So what Magnus does is he decides to push his pawn. Now this does make this pawn maybe a bit of a weakness, maybe it's getting a bit overextended, but keeps the center closed, which mitigates these bishops a bit, and it comes with tempo, which is nice. So what Wesley does is he jumps his knight forward, now threatening to take this pawn, and Magnus seems to ignore it. Now I had to look at a while, why isn't this pawn free? But basically, if he decided to take, what you do is you first take the bishop, rook recaptures, and then you have this knight fork, queen fork, sorry. You attack the knight, you attack the rook, and white's doing great. So you've always got to be careful, and in the Ruy Lopez, I guess you can start to set these traps yourself. So first Wesley decides to trade the bishop, Magnus jumps forward, and now he's counterattacking this pawn. And I say counterattacking, but it's not super obvious. White has 2 attackers on that pawn, and black has 2 defenders. So it should be safe, but it's because of the tactics in the position, and it all relates to this knight here on f5. So the reason is, let's say Wesley just takes that pawn. We can now take this pawn, and it looks like we're hanging our knight, but if black tries to capture it, we can take with the queen, seemingly sacrificing our queen because we have this the knight fork on knife f5. King has to move, we recapture the knight, and we're doing, honestly, better. You can see plus 1.4 or 1.14 for the engine. So Wesley doesn't do that. Wesley instead goes off to the side. And now, again, there's so many tactics still, just so many pieces still on the board. The problem is this piece looks free, but we are putting that pressure now on f2. So Magnus first decides to get rid of that knight, which was annoying him, and now starting to set up some trades. So we know how good Magnus is at these endgames, and Wesley accepts, but it allows Magnus to get this really far advanced pawn. Again, it's a double-edged asset. It's getting a bit far away, might be a bit hard to defend, but it could also win the game for Magnus. Wesley's first move is to centralize his knight. He's not too worried about attacking this piece just yet. The knight now controls the pawn from moving, and is just more centralized. So very helpful move. And Magnus moves to the c-file. Now, I would have expected him to go to the d-file, or at least bring the other rook to the c-file, but it does make sense. He can infiltrate position this way, so perhaps that's what he was thinking. And this pawn is defended by this knight at the moment, but it's still a little flimsy. I mean, you could play g6, and then this pawn would be without a defender. But what Wesley does is he pushes his bishop back, threatening to take this knight, and also, again, just piling up, not allowing Magnus to easily push this pawn. So what Wesley does is, what Magnus does now is he jumps his knight forward. This is the tactic we kind of saw earlier. In this position, it just forces the king to the side, but this is good in general endgames. This king is further away from the center, and obviously this knight is just a monster here, really clamping down on black's position, and you can see it's plus 0.85, so certainly Magnus is doing well, but I wouldn't want to be black in this position. It looks very difficult to play. So what Magnus does now is starts to deal with these queenside pawns and just generally gain some more space. Wesley then maneuvers his bishop, threatening to take here. So Magnus takes back. Wesley gets a more centralized bishop, but now Magnus is starting to pressure that a6 pawn as well. So generally helpful, activating his rook. And now he starts to, again, just centralize his pieces. The rook comes in, threatening to take this knight. So the knight moves. This is a fork on the pawn. But Magnus just ignores it, decides to move to d5, and Wesley decides not to take the pawn. Now, I think Wesley just thought maybe it was a bit too greedy to take that pawn. This pawn could maybe start to get out of control. So now Magnus decides, now that his rook is nicely placed, let's get that pawn out of the danger zone. And now Wesley just pushes his pawn, makes it so this knight can't jump forward to this square, restricting this knight as well, and maybe giving some luft for his king for some back rank problems. So just a very helpful move in general in this position. And Magnus drops his rook back. Now he's threatening to take this pawn. Wesley defends it with f5. And now Magnus continues to develop his pieces. Now that this knight couldn't enter the game this way, he's going around this way. And Wesley starts to move his king closer to the center, but you gotta be a bit careful. It was a lot safer over here, and this knight is very far advanced, so Wesley has to be very careful of some knight forks. Knight forks. Keep saying that after the knight f5. What Magnus does here is he's getting sick of how far advanced these pawns are. He wants to start breaking them up, and that's why you see f3. And Wesley decides to jump his knight back, defending this pawn while also counterattacking this pawn. But Magnus calmly moves his rook to the b-file. But the problem is, this rook is now not doing much. All it's doing is defending this one pawn. And you can see the engine is starting to tip in black's favor, because at the same time, I'm still worried about Magnus's pawn. This is looking very difficult to defend. We now have 2 attackers, and if black gets rid of our knight, this pawn would be lost. But fortunately for Magnus here, there's some awesome tactics that work in his favor. So first, he decides to trade in the center. Black recaptures, adding another attacker to that pawn. But first, Magnus jumps back with his knight, counterattacking the rook. Rook moves back. Magnus jumps forward. Now it looks like, again, there's enough attackers here, but there's this brutal fork that Black has to worry about. So he runs the king forward, stopping that infiltration square there. But now Magnus reignites the threat, moving the rook to the e-file. The problem is, if this knight moves, suddenly this check is available again. Wesley decides now is the time to trade off this knight for the bishop, but I'm not sure if that was the best move, and the engine doesn't really agree. Now we have connected passes, which is not looking great, but Wesley tries to take some tactics in mind here, moving the rook, attacking the knight because this pawn is actually pinned. These rooks are now staring at each other. So Magnus addresses that, getting the rook on a defended square. And now here's the big blunder of the game. Wesley thinks he can finally win that pawn. The rook is defended. These tactics don't work out. But what he doesn't realize and missed in this crucial moment is Magnus has that knife fork. The knight fork. I can't stop saying it, but it's been hovering over them all game long. This knight that we knew was just so deadly finally bears fruit. Wesley's going to lose a piece, and with that, he decides to resign the game. With that game over, let's look at the next match. Now, this match is important because it's going to show how we can consistently learn and apply those principles that we saw in the last match, and this is why Magnus makes the Ruy Lopez look so simple. He's able to get these recognizable positions with each game, and you'll see why. So, this is a Berlin defense. Hikaru's playing knight f6 here, attacking this pawn, and what did Magnus do last game? When the pawn was under attack, he played d3. So that's what he does here. Hikaru then develops his bishop, and Magnus actually decides to just move his bishop back immediately. So you can see he's just getting a very similar setup. He's even okay wasting a tempo seemingly to do it. So don't worry too much about what the move order comes in. Generally, the games will transpose into these similar positions, and you can see if Magnus is doing it, you should be able to too. So Hikaru activates his bishop, playing d6, maybe that pin comes into effect here. And Magnus allows it this time, deciding to castle. Like we were mentioning, h3 can be a bit risky if Black hasn't castled yet, because they can then just pawn storm and try and checkmate you straight away. So Magnus allows it, and now it's the same structure. You can see c3, stopping that knight jumping forward. And Hikaru's the one first, actually, to play h6, and now Magnus does. You can see, this is the exact same position, except there's no a6, but it's fine. Magnus is obviously very comfortable in these positions, and he's going for it. In this position, Hikaru drops his bishop back. Sometimes these d4 strikes can be a bit annoying when they come with tempo here, so that's why you see that preemptively. And Magnus just develops his pieces to those same squares we saw last game. Hikaru plays a6, Magnus moves his rook, and as Hikaru moves his bishop back, we've actually transposed into the exact game from last time. So you can see, even though it was a different move order, Magnus was dedicated. He wanted this position, and eventually, this isn't going to happen obviously all the time in your games, but it has literally transposed into the exact position we had last game. And what did Magnus do there? Maneuvered his knight. Hikaru maneuvers his knight as well, and here comes the d4 strike. It's exactly what we saw earlier. The knight moves to defend. He jumps forward now with his knight, which is now a little bit different. So now the game is in a bit of unique territory, but we still have that same b5 strike by Black, by Hikaru here. Magnus moves the bishop back to the exact square we saw earlier. Again, we can just reuse these principles, and here comes the strike. It's the exact same game. The only difference is this knight is on a different square, and Magnus decides to push with a4 here. So, bit of a different position. This is also generally a good move in these Ruy Lopez positions, just gaining space on this queen side as well. You don't always have to attack on the king side or in the center like we saw last game. Always consider a4 to break up Black space as well. Hikaru just develops normally, putting more pressure on this pawn here. And just like last game, the dark square bishop comes to the same square, defending this pawn, but Hikaru shifts the focus, brings us into a new game here, pushes his b pawn, so getting aggressive. Magnus decides to keep the center closed, the flank closed, at least for now, by pushing his a-pawn even further up the board. And now Hikaru decides to resolve some of the tension. First he trades his b-pawn, then his c-pawn, and now repositions his bishop here. It's going to be a really nice square if it can get to b5. But first, Magnus moves his queen up. Hikaru doesn't see the threat. just moves his rook, and now we have the bishop sacrifice. Now, I said before that you can normally do this bishop sacrifice all the way from c1, but it also works so well when you set up this queen battery. Hikaru recaptures, the queen swings in, and Hikaru is in a lot of trouble here because this knight is going to jump forward, threatening checkmate. It is not looking like an easy hold here. It's looking impossible according to the engine, but there's a few tricks that Hikaru has left. He doesn't resign straight away. First, he moves his queen. Again, he's getting ready to go back there. Magnus redeploys his bishop onto a more active diagonal, and Hikaru tries to block that down with his pawns. We see some trades, and here comes the trick. Now, Hikaru jumps his knight forward, and now when Magnus attacks the tempo with the queen, Magnus does not recapture. First what he does, Hikaru doesn't recapture. He throws in this bishop check. Now, I saw this, and I'm thinking, like, is Hikaru just trying to flag Magnus? What's going on here? Magnus doesn't take the bishop. Now, I would have lost to this tactic for sure, but if you took the bishop, you have this knight check, and it's a fork on the king and the queen. Now, that square is recaptured, but these knights then work together. So that's why Hikaru tried his best for that tactic, but it did not work out. Now he's trying to run his queen back, defend that checkmate square, but now Magnus gets the free queen. Hikaru tries to chase away the queen, but now the queen comes, giving a check. Hikaru desperately blocks, Magnus moves his rook, and then eventually Hikaru, he's had enough with this game, he's down heaps of material, it is over, he decides to resign. And now I have a bonus match for you. It covers this d6 variation, which is incredibly rare at the GM level. Now, you'll see it all the time if you're below that. Below 2,000, this is like 25% of the time or something like that. They'll play d6, so it's very common. This is what I like to do against the Ruy Lopez because I just don't want to worry about this pawn. But Magnus doesn't have any games on chess.com in this position. I had to go all the way back to a game from the year 2000, which Magnus was a small 10-year-old at the time. But I looked into it. He was around like 1600 rating strength FIDE, so probably a lot better than all of us, even at that young age. And he's got an interesting line. So let's check it out. He starts with d4. Now, the last two games, we were kind of talking about how you can get the same position if you go for it generally, but Magnus as a 10-year-old is not after that. Instead, pushing d4, Black decides to recapture. We get this position. Black then defends his knight with the bishop, and I've had this position all the time. This is super common, but a move I have never seen, which is what Magnus plays here, is dropping his knight back to b3. Now, I know Magnus in the present day loves doing stuff like this. This isn't a particularly theoretical line, but it's taking his opponents out of theory, getting that new position, and just allowing a maneuvering game from there. So he does that now. He did that as a child, and we got an interesting game to watch now. So Black decides to push a6. You see this all the time in the Ruy Lopez. And Magnus just drops his bishop back. Not in a rush to trade his bishop for that knight. Black then develops his knight normally. Magnus castles. More development. Magnus then brings the knight out to c3. We saw earlier that Magnus loves to push c3 with the pawn. But since he's lacking a d-pawn, that would make a lot less sense. He's not supporting a d4 strike there. So that's why we see c3. Makes a lot of sense. Black castles. And here comes f4. So playing aggressive, trying to open up this rook. Black tries to attack the queen with tempo, but Magnus just slides over. This is a really common maneuver to remember when you have pushed your f-pawn because it allows the queen to enter the game. Generally by that g3 square, start to line up with the king, and it gets difficult for Black to defend. So Magnus moves his queen to e3. Black decides to drop his bishop back to d7. Maybe a waste of tempo, but you can see it's still very even. And here comes Magnus, coming with the queen to g3. Black decides he doesn't want to deal with that pressure there, so pushes g6, but it does soften this knight up a little bit and creates a potential hook, so there are chances for h4, h5 in the future. But Magnus decides instead to go after the throat straight away with f5, going immediately after this hook. But it does give this square this powerful outpost now for the knight. While being a strong outpost, this knight is also threatening to capture this bishop here, and Magnus just ignores that threat, decides to develop his bishop, threatening to take this knight now. So the knight takes the bishop, Magnus gets more control of the center, But now here comes this knight, I keep saying knife, even still saying knife after knight f5. We saw so much of it the last 2 games, but here, this is just knight h5, but it's a nice fork on the queen and the bishop here. So black is going to guarantee themselves the bishop pair, but it's still a very even game because Magnus still has an attack roaring here. Might be able to push f6 and sneak in here. Might just decide to open up the f-file that way. So there's a lot of possibilities for Magnus. So first, black decides to stop that threat by plugging the hole with the f6 bishop here. Magnus decides to take. Black recaptures, and now it's a little bit suspect. There is a discovery here on the queen, but Magnus can always take this rook because the queen would be forced to recapture, so it's not the most disastrous. And black forces their hand. Instead of playing with the bishop pair, which probably would have been the best way forward, you can see the engine is minus 0.5, so very healthy for black here. Sorry, first it's white's move. Magnus decides to just move out of the way, getting out of this weak diagonal, and then black decides to take the knight. Now this is good from the engine actually, so engine likes it even though it's giving up that dark squared bishop, but it does force us essentially into an endgame. So first Magnus takes the rook, takes the queen. Black decides to recapture with the king, which seems like a bit of a mistake because I feel like getting this rook onto the open file makes a lot more sense. Magnus finally recaptures, and then you can see black actually moves his king back to then bring his rook into the game. So maybe some confusion, but it's not too bad. Magnus now re-centralizes his king, now that it's more of an endgame at the moment. And black starts to push his pawns, getting that space, trying to potentially queen on this queen side. So Magnus just continues to push his pawns as well. Both players trying to set up their best chances in the endgame. And black is showing some serious indecision here. They've actually given up their advantage, moving the rook back here, maybe trying to prepare this b4 break, but I'm not sure what that b4 break would do either. So black showing some indecision. Magnus just moves his king forward. The break comes, and Magnus decides to decline it, which makes a lot of sense. Now this rook is particularly silly, just staring at its own pawn. So black brings his king forward as well. Magnus does the same, and now here comes the rook again. Now it's an equal game. In this endgame, black has had the luxury of moving their rook like 4 or 5 times now at this point, but we'll see how it goes. Was Magnus as a 10-year-old as good at endgames as he is now? He slides out of the way of the rook. Now the rook is putting some pressure here, and Magnus has to be a little careful because his pawn is on a light square, and this bishop could start to cause some problems. But black instead just decides to start pushing their kingside pawns, hoping that maybe some extra space there could help out in that potential of a further endgame and being able to promote to a queen. In this spot, Magnus decides to push his king even further, maybe now threatening to infiltrate here and go after these weak pawns on the king side. Maybe a pretty big downside actually of pushing this H pawn here from black. But black decides to lift their rook up, maybe potentially preparing a check here on the f-file, and Magnus continues to push his pawns. Pushes e5, black decides to keep the tension for now, shifting their king over, and Magnus pushes e5 now, so trying to create that pass pawn. Black doesn't let them, decides to initiate some trades here, but the engine still thinks white is good, but not necessarily decisively better, plus 0.63, but this feels like Magnus is in absolute control. His king is amazing, his pawns are more advanced, this knight is about to jump into the game, so it's looking tough for black to hold here. Black continues to try and push their kingside pawns, but here comes Magnus's knight. Black doesn't want to trade this bishop, so drops it back, and now Magnus is going after these weak pawns that black has been creating by pushing them further. He tries to keep everything together by continuing the march, but now Magnus shifts his focus away from these kingside pawns and wants to infiltrate on the queen side, maybe go after this weak c-pawn. Black continues to push their pawns, but Magnus decides to freeze things up there. His pawn is importantly on a dark square as well, so this bishop doesn't have any targets. And black now makes this strange move, moving their king over to f7, showing that they potentially want to try and win this pawn down here, but there's just no easy way to attack this pawn. You can't go down the h-file, it's blocked there, and obviously this knight is controlling a lot of key squares as well. So this looks like the wrong plan for black, and the engine agrees. Magnus is starting to get a decisive advantage. His king is more active, and there's more easier prospects to win these pawns himself. So he activates his king, bringing it to the c-file, threatening to capture this pawn, and black just decides to sacrifice it, moves his king over, and this is the beginning of the end. Things spiral very quickly from here. Magnus first collects that pawn. The bishop comes, threatening to capture the knight, but the knight just moves. Black then sacrifices another pawn, probably blunders at this point, because Magnus takes that one, takes the next one, and at this point, Black's final hope, final dream, is to hopefully win this g-pawn and promote his owed queen. The plan they had from the very start that started this kind of death spiral, but Magnus has the fork here, plays knight d4, hits the king and the bishop. The king can't take the pawn or else you lose the bishop with check, and this knight is going to have no problem stopping this pawn. So black tries to move his king, but it's over. These pawns are way too far advanced. Black has run out of time, and I'll just quickly show you the end, but Magnus is lethal till the very end, just moving his king over and gets checkmate. If you want to see more of Magnus, you can check out my video on Magnus taking on the Scholar's Mate. He makes that look easy too. No chance of that early checkmate, so check that out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.